Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Frank, you said New York. You said 9:30 on New York time. Don't you mean 10:30?
I do. Thank you. I'm not used to living in multiple time. So thank you.
I get
it. 10:30 New York time.
And I want to take just a moment to thank Frank and Fordham for hosting and organizing such an important conference. As a Fordham alum from Fordham Law School, I'm particularly pleased and honored to join you today. And I do want to say what a pleasure and an honor it is for me to present to this group. An honor because of the range and scope and variety of perspectives that everyone here brings to the table on these very important topics. And for very similar reasons, quite a pleasure to present in this context. I often talk about these topics to audiences that are not uncommonly interested in one of the areas that we're focusing on at today's conference. Sometimes my audience has a knowledge and interest in biblical thought, in theology, and hermeneutics, but not necessarily much background or frankly, even all that much interest in areas of disability. And at the same time, some of my audiences are quite familiar and advocates for disability rights and acceptance and inclusion, but may not have an interest or background in religious or theological areas. And I have a feeling, and I'm hoping without presuming too much, that today's audience will allow me to make a few very basic points in the limited time that we have for each of the speakers. And just to make that point with that in mind, we have been asked by the conference moderators, understandably and appropriately, to stay within our time limits. And I recognize as the first speaker on the panel, that's important for me to do so that we can continue to proceed accordingly. So I'd like to very briefly describe the thesis of my study of my book, as you mentioned, Shannon. The title of the book was Yosef, Biblical Joseph, son of Jacob, on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. To state the thesis, some of the basic evidence I find in both the biblical text and in biblical hermeneutics and the commentators, specifically the Jewish biblical commentators over the years, over the millennia, Midrashim, medieval commentators, contemporary commentators, perhaps give one or two examples in the time that we have, and perhaps offer a couple of lessons that we might draw to contemporary methods of inclusion and acceptance of individuals with various disabilities, and specifically autistic individuals. So I realize that's a lot to pack into this very limited time. So just to move forward, my own background derives from both rabbinic studies and, as you mentioned, legal studies. And I've always had an interest in Joseph, in the story of Yosef. Not surprisingly, I guess, many of you probably have been interested, wondered, puzzled perhaps by the story. And of course, it's taken on a cultural significance beyond its religious significance for many of us. It has a cultural significance, worldwide in literature, in Broadway plays. And to me, if DreamWorks can do an animation on it, that proves its cultural significance. So the questions to me just stand out at you as to Joseph's relationship with his brothers, his relationship with his father, this remarkable story where he moves from these controversies, these difficulties, these social altercations per se, with his brothers, with his peers, the difficulty his father Jacob has navigating these situations, his ultimate rise to Egypt, although there are two quite tumultuous, as it turns out, on social levels, but ultimately on what we might, in contemporary terms, consider to be an employment level. His professional rise is quite dramatic and quite remarkable if we look at how the arc of the story proceeds. And ultimately, it's Pharaoh of all people who recognizes the talents, the skills he has, and installs him in this position where he has the ability to shine. So just very briefly, I don't plan to read from my book, but just I'd like to read very briefly from one page at the very introduction of the book. I describe recognizing as well. There's a saying I'm fond of that if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've met one person on the autism spectrum. So of course, individuals who are autistic vary widely in symptoms and behaviors, but it seems to me, and again, assuming a degree of familiarity with the story itself, that we do find in the story of Yosef, common characteristics that are found among many individuals on the autism spectrum, including many of the behaviors that Joseph exhibits and the interactions he experiences. For example, social challenges punctuated by an inability to read social cues, understand and anticipate the feelings and reactions of others, and navigate social settings. So as you know, and one of the most significant or at least renowned parts of the story begins with Joseph's dreams. And he tells his brothers his dreams, which are thinly veiled indications of a seeming ambition on his part to essentially rule over them. And not surprisingly, they are nonplussed, to say the least, to hear this. And yet, when he has more dreams, he goes back and tells those dreams again. He doesn't quite get that this is not the way he should be expressing himself and interacting with his brothers. He has an attachment to animals, and this sometimes is expressed as an attachment to inanimate objects in place of interpersonal relationships. There's a biblical verse near the start of the story, and again, this is quite technical. This is a discussion that I will very briefly mention now. It takes much more study and explanation in other contexts. The shorthand for this audience, the biblical text in the Hebrew is ro'eh et echav batzon, and many biblical commentators make the point of this unusual locution of ro'eh et echav, suggesting that he was really good at shepherding, that he was a leader among his brothers in shepherding. And of course, we know instances, perhaps some of the most famous known or identified autistic individuals in the world, Temple Grandin, for example, without stereotyping, without drawing any conclusions more generally, but we do know that there are individuals on the autism spectrum with particular skill in areas such as being an expert in animal science, or, and I'd never speak for John Elder Robinson, I'm so thrilled and honored to have you with us, John, but John's expertise, for example, and you certainly speak for yourself as always, in areas such as technology, in areas such as music/technology, in areas such as being an expert in cars. So we do find this in Joseph, and we do find this common among individuals on the autism spectrum quite often. A heightened intellectual capacity and creativity in narrow areas of interest. And Joseph is just a master at dreams, whether it's his own dreams, whether it's interpreting the dreams of the butler and the baker, as you might call them. He's in prison. Whether it's, of course, interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. He's really good at this, and he's really good, in his case, at making sure his own dreams come to fruition. Repetitive and inflexible behaviors. And as you read through the story, Joseph sticks to his own sense of the way he wants things to proceed. He's what we might call stubborn, what appears to be an inflexibility to others, where he has to have the same routine. And again, there are many examples beyond the contours of my brief presentation today where this plays out. An obsessive and compulsive focus on a private way of perceiving the world. And of course, here too, his dreams and his insistence that these dreams come to fruition, that ultimately his brothers and his father Jacob will appear before him when he is the king, or at least the viceroy, second in command, it seems, in the Egyptian empire. Well, this is something that he sees as necessary, as important, in a way that matches his own view of the world. And along those lines, a rigid and literal perspective on truth, ethics, and morality that sees virtue in extreme terms rather than allowing for nuance. And an example here, Joseph's resistance of the propositions, of the temptations, of the threats of the wife of Potiphar, where he is true to his own morality. And earlier on, and this is one example I want to give of the two very brief examples of potential lessons for inclusion. Early on in the story, as you recall, after Joseph tells his brothers the first dream, he then tells his brothers and his father, Jacob, the second dream he has, once again indicating that he's going to be the center of the story. He's going to rise to great heights. And his brothers, of course, are quite unhappy, to say the least, to hear of this. And eventually they will take this out on him in very extreme terms, mirroring, and in many ways, tragically, mirroring what we see to this day in terms of inclusion, in terms of ostracization, in terms of bullying, isolation, and worse, when it comes to individuals who are neurodivergent, when it comes to this issue of neurodiversity, important lessons, within spirituality and beyond. So at one point, Joseph's brothers go off to tend their sheep elsewhere, and Jacob sends Joseph off to check on them. And one of the many, many puzzling aspects of the story is, why did Jacob do this? Didn't Jacob realize that when Joseph is alone with his brothers, that's just going to place him in a vulnerable position, as it does, of course, and ultimately they apparently come near to actually killing Joseph. Instead, they end up selling him to slavery in Egypt. So I'd like to suggest that what Jacob was trying to do was model a form of inclusion, and likewise giving Joseph the renowned or famous or infamous coat of many colors, which of course we look back 2020 hindsight and say, well, that's going to breed further jealousy on the part of the brothers. I think Jacob was trying to implement a form of inclusion, a form of recognizing Joseph's strengths, Joseph's skills. And again, it goes beyond the few minutes I have described in the book. I document many areas where it seems Jacob recognized these particular skills, intellectual skills that Joseph had, and he wanted to bring this out. And Jacob also recognized that Joseph has these skills at shepherding. So here's the thinking. Joseph, go check on your brothers. And actually the language in the text is check on Shalom Achicha, the piece of your brothers, how they're doing, and Shalom Hatzon. Also see how the sheep are doing. Unusual suggestion. What do you mean see how the sheep are doing? Well, many commentators suggest that the goal was demonstrate the skills that Joseph had. Go check on your brothers, see how they're doing, and if they have any issues, explain to them what they should be doing because you're really good at this. Now, we all know that sometimes well-meaning adults, teachers in particular, may have attempts of inclusion, may try to highlight the skills of children and others who are neurodivergent, in particular when it comes to autism, and try to demonstrate those skills to their peers. But it seems to me that what Jacob got right was his intention, clearly, but what Joseph didn't get quite right was what we often see, all too often see, in the school setting, for example, where a teacher will take, and again, these are stereotypes, but they're not uncommon. Let's say there's a popular kid who might need some help, and let's just say in mathematics. And let's say, again, somewhat stereotypically, but not inaccurately, there's a student on the autism spectrum who's good at math. So the teacher might say, okay, the two of you go out in the hall, and you know what? You help the other kid. And right, isn't that a great idea? Win-win. And unfortunately, as we all know, it's often going to be a lose-lose, because the last thing someone wants to be told is, well, you're not good at this, and here's the unpopular kid. Here's the kid who's already marginalized. Joseph, whom you already don't like, whom you already are jealous of, and in fact you hate per se, well, here, listen to what he has to tell you because he's really good at this. And in that unstructured, unsupervised environment, in a sense, Jacob was setting Joseph up, unfortunately, for the tragedies that resulted. Of all things, the counterexample I would like to provide and suggest in just a couple of remaining minutes I have is the example of Pharaoh. And here, Pharaoh, from everything we know, and this is probably not the exact same Pharaoh who not shortly not so long after, ends up enslaving and almost exterminating the children of Israel, the nation that Joseph was from. Pharaoh, we have no reason to believe, I have no reason to believe, was good-hearted, was well-intentioned, but from everything we can tell, Pharaoh did care about himself and was a very effective leader of the Egyptian empire. So when Pharaoh is faced with Joseph, and as you know, the backstory here, Joseph has interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker quite skillfully, quite precisely, quite remarkably. The butler recommends, quote unquote, Joseph to Pharaoh. And if you look in the biblical text here too, just for those who are interested, the butler uses very unusual language, almost derogatory, in fact, derogatory language, referring to Joseph as a Na'ar, an Eved, an Ivri, all clearly pejorative terms in that context. And Pharaoh still wants to hear what this person has to say. And if you look at the encounter between Joseph and Pharaoh, and I'll close with this, you see Joseph saying the wrong thing. You see Joseph expressing himself the wrong way. You see Pharaoh willing to talk to this slave, this individual who has allegedly and falsely been accused of attacking the wife of Pharaoh's trusted advisor, the individual that even in recommending Joseph, the butler has described in rather pejorative terms. Pharaoh needs someone to interpret his dreams, and this is the job interview. No one else can do the job. Everyone else, he searched for his entire kingdom, all of the wise people, all of the magicians, sorcerers, they're not able to interpret the dreams. So Pharaoh is at a loss. He's desperate. He says, okay, bring this person in. And again, without getting too much into the biblical text, if you look at the interactions between Pharaoh and Joseph, what we find common among individuals on the autism spectrum is that everything Joseph says is accurate, is correct, but he expresses it in socially questionable ways. And he's bringing the bad news. He's telling Pharaoh what no one else wanted to tell Pharaoh, which is that these dreams mean there's going to be famine before there's feast, which means that you better be ready. You, Pharaoh, are facing some real problems. And the contemporary lesson I'd like to suggest in terms of Pharaoh's acceptance of Joseph, once again, not necessarily for any well-intentioned reasons, for any kind reasons, but at the very least, in his own self-interest, Pharaoh sees value in Joseph. And we can think in contemporary terms of the job interview, where we're so used to the games, we're so used to autistic individuals having difficulty in job interviews because it's not uncommon for autistic individuals to express their frustration in trying to answer the questions truthfully. And we all know that the job interview, more often than not, is a game. It's this stylized play. It's the interviewer saying to you, what are your faults? And of course, you're not supposed to say your faults. You're supposed to say, well, I'm a perfectionist. Oh, I work too hard. Oh, if I'll be there till midnight to get the job done. And many autistic people will say, oh, here are some of my faults. I'm going to go A, B, C, D, thinking that honesty will work to their own advantage. And the story of Joseph, time and again, his honesty, his sincerity, his truthfulness and dedication to morality often act in a way that harms in the end, acts in a way that's ultimately to his own self-detriment. In the case of this interview, as it were, of all things, Pharaoh turns around, disregards the social mishaps, and looks at the skills that Joseph can bring and decides, you're the person for the job. And what Pharaoh does, rather than denying or papering over the differences, Pharaoh announces to the kingdom. He says, have you ever seen someone like this? This person is different, but it's the differences that he has that we are going to exploit, that we are going to draw from, that are going to pave the way for us to survive through the famine and then ultimately the feast and the famine that are going to occur. And for that reason, I'd like you to make sure to listen to Joseph. And what Farah does is he works a different form of inclusion. He supervises Joseph as necessary. And then once he has set what I think contemporary terms refer to as the structures, the supports, what we consider the accommodations in place, well, at that point, Joseph's ready to display his skills. Joseph's ready to shine. Not that he's quote unquote cured of autism. We're not talking about a cure. We're not talking about someone not being autistic when they're an adult. And that's where we are as a society, recognizing the neurology, recognizing neurodiversity, but at the same time recognizing that with the proper supports, with the proper structures, with the proper understanding and acceptance, autistic people can contribute in ways that we should all appreciate. So with that, I think I'd like to take questions.
Dr. Levine and I have talked about this idea of an autistic Joseph for some time now. And we've talked about it in a number of different formats. One thing that strikes me is that a number of people have said that his suggestion that Joseph was on the spectrum is blasphemous. It's a horrible thing to say. How can you say that? And I think that what that shows us is the terrible stigma that we associate with autism. We think that saying he's on the spectrum is a horrible thing to say about him. I mean, who can imagine saying that it would be blasphemous for Dr. Levine to have written The Genius of Joseph? Nobody would have taken issue with that. And I think that it's all in how you see, how you interpret the words. And it speaks to what this idea of neurodiversity is. Autism is a medical term that describes a set of behavioral traits that collectively result in significant disability for the affected individual. But those of us, and I'm an autistic person, those of us who have these traits recognize that while they disable us in certain contexts, they also provide us with extraordinary gifts in other contexts. And so to look at the traits through a medical lens, how are we disabled? And essentially, Dr. Levine went through that right now, the fixations, those are the attributes as they lead to disability. But if instead we look at the attributes as they contribute to life, like he pointed out, Joseph, because of those traits, was really poorly equipped to deal with social situations, but he was extraordinarily well equipped to deal with situations that required logic, reasoning, and types of understanding that other people don't have. And I think that if instead of saying, was Joseph autistic, which is a word that is freighted with negative meaning for many listeners, if we say, might Joseph have had a very logical, systematizing, structured brain? That's not a question that has stigma. And I think that that's an important point in looking at this. So if you read the narrative of Joseph and you look at everything that's been written in thousands of years since then, you can see that the story of Joseph describes a set of behaviors that were familiar to the general population thousands of years ago. However, we did not associate those behaviors with a certain type of brain until the dawn of the 21st century. Now that we have done that, and we can say people with this autistic neurotype or this systematizing, logical, rational neurotype we are likely to behave in ways very similar to Joseph. That means that a person like me can look at him and he can say, well, he behaved just like I would behave, and I know that because I'm autistic, and many autistic people act that way. However, I would not have had the tools to say he's like me without the knowledge of autism that I've acquired in the current day. So why does that matter? Here's why it matters. Because for several thousand years, people interpreted the story of Joseph, and they did not have a context of understanding that people had different brains. So they were not able to say, well, Joseph is just this kind of thinker who's different from most other people. Nobody knew. And you might think, well, how could nobody know? I'm a smart guy, and I lived the first 40 years of my life able to get by, but having many, many social failures and work failures because I didn't understand that my brain is different than somebody else. If you see the world in black and white, how can you ever know somebody next to you sees it in brilliant color? You can't. It's your reality. So today we are possessed of an understanding of brain differences that allows us to put the context of the story of Joseph in this place. And I think that is really, really important, because the story of Joseph shows that this is a human behavior that has been central to us all these years, from biblical times to today. And I would offer you just an interesting point to ponder when you think about the story of Joseph. Joseph's story just is a life story. But take any foundational religious document from Torah, the Bible, the Quran, and if you look at the document and you say, I'm going to jot this passage down as a word of advice, this passage, you'll find that those foundational religious documents contain bits of advice that could be described as logical, rational arguments that must be grounded in science. Do not eat raw pork or you will die. That's a scientific observation. And then you find there are arguments that are grounded in emotion, belief, and dogma. There is only one God, and fear me, or I will smite you. That's an example of an emotional plea. Most people are guided by emotion, but logic is needed for other things. Emotion can't tell you when you should not do something that will harm you in many circumstances. And I would submit that the foundational writings in just about every religion were assembled by a group of people, some of whom had this logical, rational, and we could even extend to say autistic neurotype, and others had a more emotional, neurotypical neurotype. And it was that combination which has made religion the important thing it is to help guide and shepherd the peoples of the world over thousands of years. But we did not know about neurotypes until today, comparatively, and therefore that point was never brought out in Midrash and earlier interpretations, because those scholars did not have the benefit of that insight which has been brought to us through modern science. And that's, I think, why this is such an important discussion. Did that make sense, or did I ramble too much?
Thank you so much, John. And I think we do have some other hands up. I think I see Willa, is it?
Yes, thank you. This I think is where the word disability breaks down, or rather where it reflects the, I can't remember the word used by the last speaker, that our culture is the problem here. I was guiding a group of developing spiritual leaders within a congregation, and one person had autism and was just this incredibly gifted preacher and counselor. But she needed accommodation. She needed help over those some of those social cues. She didn't present the way people thought a spiritual leader ought to present. She didn't smile enough. And we got stuck in this loop of, if it's a disability, then she's not qualified for leadership. If it's not a disability, then why are we making accommodations? The results in this case were tragic and disappointing. But I use the word disability about myself. There are clearly some things that don't work for me, though in a different context, I can offer my gifts. And autism is this peculiar, extreme example of, no, it offers incredible gifts. It's society that doesn't know how, it's society that's disabled in its ability to receive those gifts.
Thank you.
I think that I did offer some reflections already, because I wasn't exactly clear on the sequence of how we would do this. But to put this in, I guess, perspective, I'm the neurodiversity scholar at William and Mary. Scholar in residence is an unusual title in American academia, but I am the scholar because one of my distant grandfathers was William and Mary's first scholar at its establishment. His father was the Anglican rector who established the church in Bruton Parish, which is now Williamsburg, Virginia, and he also had the pulpit in Jamestown, which at that point was the colonial capital. So he was very influential theologian at the establishment of the Virginia colony and prior in pre-revolutionary America. His son, for whom I'm the scholar in his honor, was one of the first students of James Blair, another Anglican theologian who came to Virginia to establish a college to teach young men for the ministry. He was one of his first graduates, and he became one of the first teachers at William and Mary to distinguish the English-trained faculty, who were the masters. The Virginia faculty became the scholars. And so that was how that tradition started, and I honor that today. So I come from a long line of Anglican theologians, and I've always had a fascination with, well, not always, but since learning about autism, I've had a fascination with how our logical brains shape our lives. And I look back at many generations of my own family tree, and I see folks who served in ministry who were logical, rational thinkers like me. Now, the description that Dr. Levine used to describe Joseph, the autistic traits, certainly imply a person who is significantly disabled. And indeed, many of us have disabilities in social settings. I, for example, have difficulty reading body language, facial expressions. I can't look in your eyes and know what you're thinking. I might get too close to you when we're talking and make you feel uncomfortable. I might turn away and make you feel like I'm ignoring you. That is part of my disability. But part of my gift, which offsets that disability, is I'm a very strong, rational, logical thinker. And I think that in ministry, you need both those kinds of thinkers. You absolutely need you need compassionate, sensitive, gentle souls to counsel people in a time of distress. There's no question that we need that in ministry. But there is also no question that we need logical, rational observers of life who can say things like eat raw pork and you will die, live in this area and you will be drowned in floods, build your bridge this way so it will not collapse. You know, we tend to think of religion today as being entirely a spiritual pursuit, but until the Enlightenment, really even until the 19th century, religion and the church was the home of what we today call science. So the developments of all of the great wonders of the world up until modern times, those all happened under the auspices of one church or another. And I would suggest to you that you may not think of the development of the arch, the development of the truss, the ability to build bridges, to build aqueducts, to make roads. You don't think of that as a product of the church, but indeed, all those things came about under church leadership by people with educations in what was then theology and the natural sciences. And I would suggest that even though we didn't know about those different neurotypes, we did know that certain people were good at those logical things and certain people were good at the emotional things. And we knew that we needed a balance of those traits. However, we didn't know how to pick one or another. We didn't have the understanding of how we came to be. We just knew that we needed those traits. Now that we have a framework with which to understand them, you can see that logical, rational people have gravitated in huge numbers to logical, rational jobs like software design or solving codes or solving puzzles. Other people have extraordinary ability to see into the souls of animals, even as they are oblivious to looking at people. Temple Grandin, my friend who Dr. Levine mentioned, is a wonderful example of that. She can just see what these horses and cattle are thinking and feeling by reading their bodies. And that's a really, really valuable thing for our species. But it's something that we only need in moderation. Most of the time, we need social, emotional abilities to get along with each other. It's only when you have a pressing problem that the person with that logical, rational brain or that other unusual cognitive ability rises to the fore. And I think the story of Joseph really illustrates that. Joseph was successful in his life because he could help chart a logic-based path through a difficult situation. You heard Dr. Levine say that Joseph told Pharaoh that there were going to be hard times before there would be good times. And while the story does not expressly say so, I think we can come away from that feeling that Joseph had the wisdom, the logical reasoning to be a guide through that. And he, of course, is remembered today for his cognitive abilities, even though when the story was written, the phrase cognitive abilities was unknown to the writers. I think that is, it's a really, really important thing. And I hope that none of you who listen to this are going to think that any of this is blasphemous or wrong. I also would like to point out that Dr. Levine and I, we are not rendering a medical diagnosis about somebody who lived far in the past. We are making observations about how that person behaved. And we are saying that those observations comports with someone who has a brain like mine. Now, you might choose to say Robeson has an autistic brain, but if we just say it's a brain like mine, a logical, rational person, there's no judgment in that. It's a comparison that I think there's no stigma. And I think it's really important to understand that we are seeking to understand historical figures in the past whose behavior was inscrutable through this lens that is afforded to us by modern neuroscience. Might we see who has questions based on that? We've got two perspectives on the story and on the broader trajectory through the years. So yeah, one person in the chat has said it's worth discussing the social model of disability and how that influences autism being a disability. I think that in simple terms, if I say to you that I'm disabled in interpersonal relationships because I can't read your body language, I don't understand what you're doing, and the chance that an interaction between us would go wrong, I think that to put that in a broader context, if you were my mother, I would not have that problem, because as my mother, you would have been looking at me all my life, and I would have looked at you all my life. And you would have learned how to read me, even if I was different from other children. And I would have learned how to read you and what to expect. And more than that, you knew me and loved me. And therefore, even if I acted strange at times, it didn't change your underlying feelings for me. So we could interact successfully. It's when I go out in the world and I deal with strangers, and when I deal with a stranger and I do something unexpected, I absolutely am disabled, because they are likely to think, hey, he's a weirdo, I don't want anything to do with him. And they turn away without giving me a chance because of my social disability. So what you can take away from that is that autism could disable me or someone like me very greatly if I was faced with dealing with strangers in quantity in social settings. But it would not disable me really at all if I was only dealing with a family group, or if I was dealing, for example, in biblical times with a community with 5 families around me, because all those families would have known that that's just how John Elder is. They would not have had any problem dealing with me, because they, again, would have known me all my life. And so in that sense, social disability that we talk about today in autism is very much a modern social construct. I saw that we had another clergyman on the call who is engaged in ministry with the deaf. And in the 17th century, when Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, the islands off coastal Massachusetts, were settled, some of those settlers came from Europe with a genetic difference that produced inherited deafness in a significant number of people. And because those people were born deaf, and there were a lot of them, those groups of islanders, both those with hearing and those who were deaf, developed a means of communication by sign language. And as it happened, they were a fishing community, and they realized that they could stand in their boats and they could sign to each other at a distance of 500 feet, when they could see each other's hands, but they couldn't hear each other's words. And therefore, communicating in sign became a strength at sea, not a disability. And since everyone signed, everyone could speak to everyone else in that community. And again, it was only when those islanders went out into the wider world and dealt with strangers who did not have the ability to sign back with them that they were disabled. Now, there are other ways in which autism can be disabling that come sometimes with other disabilities. We could, for example, have an intellectual disability where we had very, very impaired reasoning power. A person who cannot talk or cannot figure out what to do in certain situations is going to be disabled in almost any situation. But there's no evidence that Joseph was disabled like that. The evidence suggests that Joseph had a social disability, like I described. And that very much is a social situational thing. And I think that that's important to understand. You know, you can break your leg, and that's a medical condition. And nobody wants to have a broken leg. You want to get healed. You want a cure for that. But being born with a neurological difference, it may disable you everywhere. But it, again, may be only a situational thing. And you can often look at something and you can say, hey, being deaf is just as disabling as having a broken leg. But look at the example of the Islanders, where being deaf was not a disability at all in their community, but having a broken leg surely would have been. Elizabeth Elias said it's important to note that autistic people connect on different levels, and we tend to be honest and straightforward.
Yes, and thank you, John, for this. You raised a great example of enhanced communality that with the deaf and non-deaf people together learning to communicate to each other and actually engage proactively in life together. It's related to the conversation at the end of Sam's presentation too that I had wanted to join, in that I agree it's important on correctly naming disabilities, you know, and moving beyond the medical model of disability as well as the social model. I think both of those, they're more like an either or in reaction to each other, but there are more integrated ones available that recognize the full, you know, complexity of the human person and also the diversity of the human family. And if we can make advancements there with actually, so not to normalize disability, let me just say, I realized I had grown up with ADHD when my son was diagnosed. He was 4.5, I was 33. And learning that kind of explained a lot of things. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be participating in this conversation today as I am without that diagnosis and recognition. But anyway, I think it's really important to understand the diversity of being human, but also for that sensitivity within the community, within our faith communities, and if we have that broader awareness, I think that leads to people recognizing, okay, maybe they're not used to interacting with someone who behaves as you do, say, perhaps. But recognizing, you know what, I do know other people with autism, or I know about different people with autism, right? And quite frankly, with ADHD, sometimes I don't quite, it's a little different than autism, but, you know, sometimes I miss out on some of the social cues as well, or I interpret the social cues and then I keep myself quiet. So I guess the only thing I want to get to is I think that it's important for us, you know, and I think it was Willa who raised the concern about, you know, the disabling effect of essentially not using the language, because that perpetuates shame. And I think what we want to do is recognize there's no better, you know, there's not a good person, or there's not a good way of being human or a bad way of being human in terms of our abilities. We're all, as people of faith in this session, we're created in the image of God, and you know, that's who we are.
I just wanted to note, as I work in a hospital, and one of my coworkers, he is autistic and his brother is autistic. And one day he came in and he was so excited to note that he had read or was talking with a group. He's part of also kind of a support group where the character on Big Bang, Sheldon, would be considered on the spectrum. And he was just so happy to talk about that. And the reason I put that out there in the sense of diversity, and this is kind of the question, as someone, as myself, who tries to be an ally, wanting to, in that sense, recognize distinctions, but also know, as it has been said, there might be some people who say it's sacrilegious to talk about, Joseph on the spectrum. Just in my point of view, I don't think I always have to direct my attention to those folks. I'd rather direct my attention to the people who get excited that they can identify with other people that they see as valuable, that they see as speaking for maybe their community, if I can use that language, because I think we see time and time again there's great value and worth in that. But I also know that it's also a tightrope sometimes between medical definitions and social definitions. But I just wanted to put that out there, that I know that there are some folks that want to celebrate, and I can't wait to talk to my friend on Monday about this discussion, in the sense of that someone as fantastic as Joseph, to be a distinguished member, and I know he's going to find great satisfaction in that. So I just kind of throw that out there, maybe a question of allyship, but also a question of being able to celebrate who people are, and not always have to worry and speaking to what I sometimes think as the lower common denominator.
For another perspective on this, I think that referring to me, Joseph, anyone else, in a context in which we talk about our life successes, talking about us as autistic is problematic, because autistic is the medical community's term for our behaviors that describe our disability. And we're not here to describe really Joseph's disability. We're here to consider what was Joseph's makeup that made him so successful as the person we read about today in the Bible, or what makes me successful as an adult in today's world. And while traits associated with autism do that, we could come up with maybe more constructive names for them. Neurodiversity is a community-generated word for neurological diversity, and in saying that people like me are neurologically diverse and we are different from the average person's neurology. That's one thing. My friend Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a autism researcher at Cambridge University in the UK, wrote a book called The Pattern Seekers. And I have said to you in this presentation, I've referred to being logical, rational thinkers. And I have to respond to one of the written chat comments. Indeed, not every person is openly like a logical person. We're not all born computer programmers. But just as Dr. Levine mentioned, a foundational element of an autism diagnosis is restrictive, repetitive interests, structuring and ordering things. Dr. Baron-Cohen's book is called The Pattern Seekers, and that really encapsulates in a nutshell a fundamental trait that many, many autistic people have. We seek patterns and order. And I think that is a trait which tends to appear in humans who have a diminished ability to sense unspoken signals from other people. And we might posit that the search for order through thought, through reason, is our counterpoint, because we can't read the unspoken emotional cues. But being a pattern-seeking kind of person, that's a word, again, that doesn't have stigma. I would encourage you to, you all to think about that. And, and I think that we have here a new set of knowledge that allows us to interpret the Bible and other ancient documents in different ways. And what's fascinating to me is when we look back at these old documents, it shows that people like me, people like you, we have had these differences forever. We've always been here. And that's a really significant thing to think. We've always been part of humanity, and we always will be. And we need to work together. You know, it is really together that we are greater than individually.
And thanks to the presenters who have already shared with us. I enjoyed your presentations, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. And before I start, just to say that I am coming at this with a number of hats. As already mentioned, I come at it as a Christian pastor, as someone who writes in the area of disability theology, as a parent of children with autism, and as someone who was diagnosed as an adult. So all of those things inform what I'm going to be talking about. So close to 20 years ago, two of my children were diagnosed with autism. And I immediately began to write and to speak on things related to autism, about our experience with our children. And this resulted in people contacting me with advice. And I was far from an expert, but I felt obligated to be able to share with them what I had learned, what I had known about. And at first, most of the questions that came my way were about parenting, about tips on how to be effective as a parent, and to provide a healthy family life, and all of those things. Sometimes they were just questions about what autism was, and helping to expand awareness about autism. However, eventually I was asked a question about how an autistic person develops spiritually. Now, that kind of took me off guard, because my main concern at that point had been primarily about how do I survive as a parent of two children with autism. All I wanted to do was to survive, to protect my children from some of their high-risk behaviors. And since my children were quite young at the time, I never really thought about their spiritual development outside of attending Sunday school at our small church. But I felt like I had to give some kind of an answer. And so I passed on the only thing that I had ever heard about this, and that was I warned them about using metaphors, because autistic people take everything literally. They shouldn't refer to Jesus as a door or the Spirit as wind. Keep all the religious language as concrete as possible. Now, this, of course, is an unhelpful stereotype, but it's the only thing that I knew at the time. Of course, there's a kernel of truth to any stereotype, but as a generalization, it really wasn't accurate, and it very much wasn't healthy. As I became more involved in the disability community, I began to encounter other ideas about spiritual formation. Autistic people at that time were seen as typical of the developmentally disabled, and was believed that they would therefore have limited cognitive abilities. Discipleship should be kept away from passing on spiritual concepts, and should move just to creating loving and welcoming communities. The belief was the experience of unconditional love within a community was sufficient for spiritual development. Now, this was better than the initial advice that I had been given, but I still wasn't satisfied. It was making assumptions about the intellectual abilities of people with autism, usually based only on the challenges they might have had with communication. I longed to be able to just ask my children, what is it that they needed to grow spiritually? Unfortunately for me, not for them, but for me, they do not communicate verbally, at least not about complex concepts. If only I had access to the autistic brain. It was then that I realized that I had access all along. I was diagnosed with autism as an adult about 8 years ago, and suddenly the challenges that I had experienced in my own spiritual formation began to make sense. I grew up attending an Anglican church, and the routine of the liturgy was comforting to me, and it continues to be when I visit other liturgical churches. However, I began to have questions about God, faith, and the Bible. It wasn't enough for me just to have my tradition say, listen, this is the way things are, and that's enough. My priest encouraged me just to stick with the prayer book, to work through the liturgy, and that everything would fall into place. But it didn't, and eventually this led to skepticism and me leaving the church. I came back to faith during my undergraduate studies, and I found myself attending a Pentecostal church, which was quite the change from my Anglican background. One aspect of their spiritual formation was the emphasis on rules of what was allowed and what was not allowed. I actually found some comfort in that because it was a lot simpler for me to just follow the rules than just to figure out intuitively what I was supposed to do. Now, I've since left much of that legalism behind, but not because I had a problem with rules in general. Rather, it was based on the lack of biblical foundation and especially the lack of consistency in much of what they were teaching. The other thing I struggled with in that faith community was the emphasis on spiritual experiences. My friends would weep and laugh and have ecstatic experiences while I would just stand there with my hands folded in front of me. I was told that you should be reacting in a worship service the same way you would react in a rock concert. Well, I was in a rock concert last night and I stood there with my hands folded in front of myself. So that's the way I am in all contexts. But the message in my church was clear. I was simply not spiritual enough. If I really loved Jesus, I would worship the way they did. A turning point for me was reading a book about different ways that people connect with God. The first book I read on this topic was The Love Languages of God by Gary Chapman. He's most well known for his love languages that deal with marriage relationships, but he also took those concepts and applied it to how people connect with God. And it acknowledged that there were different ways for people to connect with God, that people were wired differently. He wasn't speaking about autism, but in general, people are wired differently and can connect in different ways. And this was a turning point for me. For the first time, I felt like I was not a spiritual failure. This understanding has become deeper as I've acknowledged and embraced my own neurodivergency. So what does spiritual formation look like for those who are neurodivergent? Well, it is formation that takes into account the different ways people think. Thomas Armstrong says this: we need a new field of neurodiversity that regards human brains as the biological entities that they are and appreciates the vast natural differences that exist from one brain to another regarding sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other important mental functions. Now, neurodiversity is larger than autism, but I'm going to focus on autism just for the sake of focus here. The danger when talking about autism is to focus on stereotypes and generalization. However, while autism is a wide spectrum, there are clusters of common experiences, and these include certain sensitivities. Olga Bogodashina identifies 4 common sensitivities for many autistic people. These include sensory, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual sensitivities. Now, all of those sensitivities could affect how we experience spiritual formation in some way. But speaking specifically of spirituality, she says this: contrary to the traditional view that autistic people experience difficulty or inability in understanding spiritual and religious notions due to their differences in sensory, perceptual, cognitive, and linguistic development, religious and spiritual experiences seem to come more easily to individuals with autism. So we should be taking spiritual formation among autistic people seriously and provide opportunities for them to develop in this area. A starting point is the perspective of Barry Prezant in his influential book, Uniquely Human. Prezant doesn't address spirituality, but he does look at behaviors by autistic people that are commonly understood as challenges. Prezant's thesis is that there is not one group of neurotypicals who act normal, and then a different group of people who are autistic who act abnormally. Rather, autistic people are doing similar things for similar reasons as neurotypicals. It just may come across differently because of their autism. Prezant says this: autism isn't an illness, it's a different way of being human. Children with autism aren't sick, they're processing through developmental stages as we all do. To hold them, we don't need to change them or fix them, we need to understand them and then to change what we do. This paper will use the same paradigm for spiritual formation. Uniquely spiritual refers to the concept that all people, whatever their neurological makeup, have to find a means to grow spiritually, and that the church needs to make room for that diversity. So how do we grow spiritually? Evan Howard describes spiritual formation in this way: Christian spiritual formation, responding to the gracious work of God and requiring both perseverance and progress, is the intentional and God-word reorientation and rehabilitation of human experience. Spiritual formation has a long history in the church, beginning with the Roman Catholic Church, but increasingly becoming more popular among Protestants. An important part of spiritual formation in its origins was the training of priests. Because it was naturally including an intellectual component. And this has spread through Protestant seminaries as well, becoming popular among pastors and lay people alike. And a major step in this spread was the publication of Richard Foster's Celebration of Disciplines. Spiritual formation became closely tied to the study and application of spiritual disciplines. There are numerous lists of these disciplines, and I've tried to apply these disciplines to my spiritual life with varying degrees of success. Trying to hear the voice of God through these disciplines is a challenge when even the concept of having a personal relationship with God is a struggle. For myself and some other autistic Christians, taking a leap of faith can be difficult. In seeking to hear the voice of God through meditation or other disciplines, there's a struggle to accept that this is truly coming from God rather than just our own thoughts. The disciplines are difficult by definition, that's why they're called disciplines, but it may be that those who are neurodivergent will struggle more than others. There are examples of people who have struggled, but after much determination, were able to make a breakthrough. Autistic people may not benefit from certain disciplines, no matter how much effort they put into it. While an emphasis on traditional disciplines may make a person feel unspiritual, there may be other means of spiritual formation. If we define spirituality as human interaction with the transcendent or divine, then anything that deepens that experience is formation, whether or not it fits into the most common forms of spiritual disciplines. I've struggled with silent meditation and Lectio Divina, but when I look up at the stars on a clear night or experience the light and the sound of a violent thunderstorm, I experience the power of God in a powerful way. This is where books such as Gary Thomas's Sacred Pathways have helped me as an autistic Christian. Thomas observes, quote, "All too often, Christians who desire to be fed spiritually are given the same generic, hopefully all-inclusive methods, usually some variation on a standardized quiet time." He acknowledges that there are different ways, things that he calls pathways, by which we can experience God. His pathways include nature, senses, tradition, asceticism, activism, caregiving, enthusiasm, contemplation, and intellectual reflection. Fighting for social justice is just as valid as contemplative prayer, which is just as valid as experiencing God in theological study. Through books like this, I've been able to explore spirituality in ways that honor how I am created. It's important to note that these books were not written for people with autism. nor should there be a neurodivergent spirituality and a neurotypical spirituality. Going back to Barry Present's concept of autistics as uniquely human, this is a concept applicable to people of all neurological makeups. A person may experience God in nature or in a theology textbook, whether they are autistic or not. How this fits specifically to neurodiversity is understanding that we are like neurotypicals, only less flexible. Going with the idea of sacred pathways, a neurotypical person can and should experiment with different ways of spiritual formation. They may find that one path comes easier, but with some work, another path is also beneficial. Shifting from one to another will not be as easy for neurodivergent Christians. An autistic or ADHD person may never be able to effectively use Lectio Divina to hear from God. On the other side of it, disciplines of silence and solitude may come too easily, so easily that they lack the spiritual exertion to bring about formation. And these differences have to be acceptable. Judy Singer, who came up with the term neurodiversity, offers this challenge. Try to imagine the kind of society in which NTs, that's neurotypicals, and autistics can interact in mutual respect for each other's differences, gifts, and deficits, where communications, protocols have been worked out between what are almost different ontological languages, different worlds of body language and expression. Integrating a better understanding of neurodiversity will be a challenge for spiritual directors. Instead of starting with the traditional spiritual disciplines and expecting the person to be successful with them, spiritual direction should take neurodiversity into account at the beginning. Traditional spiritual disciplines should not be rejected, but they should be augmented by other activities that may be more conducive for the way a person has been created. Dallas Willard, after warning that Sunday worship services are not enough for spiritual formation, said this, quote, "Individuals and local congregations of disciples must discover and effectively implement whatever is required to bring about the inner transformation of those who have really become apprentices of Jesus and who really do gather in immersion in the Trinitarian presence." Gary Thomas concludes his book with this statement: "Can we, in Christian humility, encourage others to nurture their souls in ways that are most effective for them as long as they remain true to orthodoxy in the historic Christian faith?" I'd hope that we would all answer yes. So what does spiritual formation for a neurodiverse church look like? It begins with understanding that we know much more about neurodiversity now than when those spiritual disciplines were first developed. Struggling with some aspects of traditional spiritual formation does not necessarily make one unspiritual or undisciplined. For some people, an increase in effort or determination is not going to be enough. We must recognize the diverse church that exists and seek to cultivate a community where formation is accessible to all. In 1 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul presents a picture of the ideal church as diversity in unity rather than uniformity. The Corinthian church valued one spiritual gift above others. Paul asks, quote, "Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret?" The answer to that question, presumably, is no. The diversity of the body of Christ must be respected. In the same way, the neurodiversity of the body of Christ must be respected in our spiritual formation. Thank you for listening. To agree with that, and that's what I was trying to get across. I want to avoid saying this is the way autistic people experience spirituality, because you can't say that any more than you can say this is the way a neurotypical person would experience spirituality. If anything, if there's that cluster that affects all autistic people, there might be maybe a lack of flexibility in some of the things. But that, going back to say to those pathways that Gary Thomas uses, an autistic person might just jump right into activism. And that is totally the way they experience God, just getting out there and fighting for justice for people with disabilities or even some other cause. But another autistic person might just dive into a systematic theology and gobble that up. And it's not going to be the same for all. So yeah, that's I would definitely affirm that.
Thank you. This has been really, really helpful. I love what you said about faith formation for a neurodiverse church. And I think that I'm getting really excited about helping churches to think about that just by having a congregation, you have neurodiversity there. And so how do we get pastors and ministry leaders to think about the fact that, not the idea that, but the fact that by having a congregation, you have people approaching spirituality, approaching the Lord, approaching scripture from a variety of neural wirings. And so I'm curious if you know of things out there that are good training for that.
So I'm gonna speak. First of all, I'm gonna put my pastor hat on and make a confession that church leaders do want easy answers. I mean, who wouldn't? If there is one way that you can do it, if there is a program or a book that you can just put your congregation through and everyone is going to come out the other end strengthened spiritually and more mature disciples, that's what you're going to want. And those promises are out there. You know, they'll be the latest thing that you can just put them through this and it's going to happen. Accepting there is a neurodiverse church is actually letting go of that dream and saying that it's not going to happen that way. That's not to say that any of those programs are necessarily wrong. There is a place for them, but we have to get out of the cookie cutter way of discipleship. And neurodiversity really goes back to relationships and thinking, listening to people and finding out what is it that they need, and find out what the resources are that are going to help them. And it really needs to be much more personalized rather than programmatic. And that means a whole lot more work for the church. And I kind of wish the efficiency side of me kind of wishes that wasn't the case, but that is. So I'll give you one example of how this worked. During my doctor ministry research, I was talking to an autistic Christian, and he was in a church that really, their emphasis, they really felt that sort of the intellectual side had been overdone. And what Christians really needed was community and sort of spiritual experience on the emotional side. That was the way forward for church growth. And he was in a small group, and they were talking about that kind of thing. And something came up in the conversation that was an opening for him to share his interest in Christian apologetics. And that was quickly shot down because that's not the direction that the church wanted to go. They felt that maybe Christian apologetics was for a previous generation that really doesn't have a place for today. And so they kind of let him know that that's not what they want to talk about. And he felt shut down. And now you might think, well, Christian apologetics, that sounds like the most boring thing, most irrelevant thing ever. But maybe for an autistic person, that's exactly how they're going to do it. How do you then provide a safe space for them to work through some of those things? So that's part of the challenge. So I can't give you an answer. Here's the website to go to that will give it to you all. But listen, just really listen to where people are at.
It makes me think of universal design.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen. This has been really good. I'm interested in your pastoral perspective on autism and sin. Good friend that is a counselor, a Christian counselor, and we were having this conversation. I was like, I'd never really thought, hamartiologically about disability, about autism. But then the reason he was asking me, so I'm a college professor, but I'm also an Anglican priest, and I have a 10-year-old son who has a diagnosis of ASD level 3. And so, got a lot of practical questions as well as kind of academic questions. So I'd be curious if you have anything to say about that.
So can you specify what role of sin? Do you mean how autistic people sin? Are they are they kind of without sin, or is autism caused by sin? I'm not sure the connection to sin.
Sure. And I think the question that my friend was asking had to do with what, a definition, they were like debating definitions of sin, and what does that look like? Well, especially like in the context of what Professor Swinton was talking about earlier about the relational aspect of the regard. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it really struck me as something like that. So I think more kind of how have you seen it pastorally? How have you had to kind of affect or change the ways that you? So like my 10-year-old, so he's nonverbal, and if I were to say to him, like, getting on YouTube is a real problem right now, and so because he just repeats what he says, and he doesn't have any context, he doesn't have any tools for kind of understanding what he should and shouldn't do, and so I'll be like, Samuel, no, stay off of YouTube. Okay, he gets off YouTube. 5 minutes later, he's right back on YouTube. 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, and so. Clearly I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not going to, work with him in the same way that I work. He has 3 older siblings, we're all neurotypical. So I would deal with it a different way than I would with him. And so I don't know if that kind of helps, or if I'm just kind of blowing the wind right now.
Yeah. So the one thing theologically I would say is we do have to avoid the sometimes stereotype of autistic people or people with disabilities in general as holy innocents, that they can do whatever they want, and God's just going to wink at it because they have a disability and he feels sorry for them. I don't think that that's quite the way things are at, but explaining it is a little bit different. Definitely at 10 years old, it's difficult to explain that to anyone, even a neurotypical. I have trouble explaining that to my neurotypical teenagers, much less anything else. But probably the tendency that he's going to feel is about rules. There is an attraction to that. They might not want to follow the rules, but we'll see sin as about rule breaking. And so just to be aware that tendency is there. I probably at that age wouldn't even try to explain it theologically in terms of this is bad and these are the consequences, just to help them to develop in positive ways and to invest in relationship as opposed to the other side. And it's a long haul. And I remember when our kids were that age, trying to enforce certain rules and to explain why, you can't just keep going there. And when they have a meltdown, that's, you want to just say, okay, well, maybe the rules don't apply to you because it'd be more convenient. It's really hard. I wish I had an easier or a better answer for you, other than I hear your brother.
My question was, in the professional world, this is a oversimplification, but in the professional world, there are two really loud voices when you're looking at neurotypicals. One is, educate for social change so that they can understand what typicals look for and how they can relate. And the other one is for them to be able to find acceptance in a group that is accepting, and to be able to, live within that context. I am familiar with the church in the area that I'm in that really has taken on that part about we can help provide a social example. We can help provide places where you can fit in and you can learn what neurotypicals expect. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on them participating in that type of area rather than how it's been discussed so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would tend to go towards a middle way. I'm not comfortable with saying neurodivergent people or autistic people in particular need to learn to act neurotypical. But nor do I necessarily think it's always healthy to say we are just going to set up a community where neurodivergent people can just do their own thing and not have to worry about neurotypicals, because we still live in a majority neurotypical world, or at least a world that has neurotypical expectations. But I definitely am against the idea of teaching neurodivergent people to mask. They should never have to mask and pretend that they are neurotypical. But at the same time, living in a relationship with people in community, we should be aware of what the some of the needs are for there. That that if a person is feeling overwhelmed with what is going on, it is absolutely right for them to experience that frustration and to be able to demonstrate that frustration in some ways. So they don't have to push it down and hide it, but there might be more productive ways to deal with it than, say, throwing chairs across a room or something like that. So I would go for the middle way. I'm very hesitant in the idea, though, of masking is very damaging to autistic people. I would actually say that it leads to PTSD, because it is traumatizing to be masking all the time, and I think it leads to just huge mental health crises. So we need to provide a safe way, but also encourage people